They called him just the maintenance guy, until the day he stepped onto the training mats and reminded everyone what real strength actually looks like. What happened next didn't just shock the elite martial arts academy. It changed everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and what it truly means to be a warrior. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you believe about strength and courage, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into a tale of redemption that proves sometimes the most unexpected heroes are hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Marcus Weber and why you should never underestimate the quiet ones. The wrench slipped from Marcus Weber's oil-stained fingers as the voice cut through the training facility like a blade through silk. Sharp, condescending, and deliberately loud enough to ensure every ear in the room would catch it. Is that your daughter or just another charity case cluttering up our premium space? Marcus didn't flinch. He remained crouched beneath the broken water heater in the maintenance corridor of the elite combat academy, his weathered hands working methodically on the stubborn pipes. But he heard every word. More importantly, so did Emma. She was 8 years old, small for her age, still wearing her school backpack that seemed to dwarf her tiny frame. Through the reinforced glass window, she had been watching the advanced class with the kind of hungry fascination that only children possess when they witness something they desperately want but know they can't have. Her small hands pressed against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface as she leaned closer to catch every movement on the pristine training mats. "Move along, kid," Coach Ryan Blackwood added with calculated indifference, not even bothering to glance in Emma's direction. His attention remained fixed on his students, a group of teenagers in spotless uniforms executing flawless combinations with the precision of machines. "Unless you're planning to mop up after we're done here. Though I doubt you could handle a mop that's probably taller than you are." The laughter that followed was surgical in its cruelty, not loud enough to seem malicious to any passing adults, but collective enough to make a child understand exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of this place. The kind of laughter that builds walls around dreams and teaches young hearts that some doors are simply not meant for them. Marcus tightened his grip on the wrench until his knuckles went white. The pipe hissed once, then fell silent. He wiped his hands slowly on his faded work shirt, rose to his full height, and stepped into the corridor. His movements were deliberate, controlled, carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of facing down situations where words matter less than presence. Coach Blackwood was still facing his class, his back turned toward the maintenance area. He didn't need to look. His words had been arrows fired over his shoulder, designed to wound without requiring him to witness the damage. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, feeling the tension in her small frame. "She wasn't in anyone's way," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the ambient noise of the training session. For the first time, Blackwood turned around. His smile was practiced, the kind that looked warm from a distance but felt cold up close. Well, he said, his tone dripping with false joviality. "The maintenance crew wants to give parenting advice now. How refreshing." The teenagers paused their training, sensing the shift in atmosphere. A few exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the tension but unwilling to look away from what was clearly becoming a confrontation. "You know," Blackwood continued, warming to his theme as he gestured toward his pristine students, "in combat sports, we teach that discipline begins with presentation. Maybe you should consider investing in some proper attire before bringing your—" He paused, letting his gaze travel over Emma's secondhand clothes and scuffed sneakers. "Your situation into our facility." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his, her fingers trembling slightly. He looked down at her, saw the flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks, and something deep inside him shifted. Not anger. He had learned long ago to master that particular demon. Something colder, more focused. "Let's go, kiddo," he said softly, helping Emma adjust her backpack. She nodded without speaking, but her eyes remained fixed on the training mats, on the world that had just made it clear she didn't belong. They turned toward the exit, but before they could reach the corridor, a voice rang out from the observation deck above. Clear, authoritative, and carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Coach Blackwood, you will apologize." Now, every head in the room snapped upward. Victoria Sterling stood at the top of the stairs, her posture as straight as her words. She wore a charcoal business suit that spoke of boardrooms and bottom lines, her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had neither time nor patience for nonsense. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her stillness suggested a storm gathering behind carefully controlled calm. Blackwood's confident smile faltered. "Miss Sterling, I was merely apologizing," she said, descending the stairs with measured steps. "Which you can do right now." The room held its breath. Marcus had seen Victoria Sterling perhaps twice in the 6 months he'd been maintaining the facility's aging infrastructure. She was always distant, always untouchable, moving through the space like someone carrying the weight of decisions that affected more than just herself. Today, something had changed. Today, she looked like someone who had finally decided to use the full extent of her power. Blackwood cleared his throat, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. "Of course. My apologies, Mr. Weber. I meant no disrespect." Marcus studied the man for a long moment, then shifted his attention to Victoria. "I've been insulted before," he said quietly. "It doesn't keep me awake at night." Victoria reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. "I didn't ask him to apologize for your sake," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent training hall. She turned to face the assembled students. "I asked him to apologize for theirs." The weight of her words settled over the room like a blanket. Then, breaking the silence, she looked directly at Emma. "Do you want to learn?" Emma's eyes widened. She glanced up at her father, uncertainty and hope warring in her expression. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was studying Victoria Sterling, trying to understand what had prompted this unexpected intervention, what game was being played here. "I'm just here to fix the plumbing," he said finally. Victoria's expression didn't change. "And I'm here to fix something else that's been broken for far too long." She addressed the class without taking her eyes off Marcus. "Everyone take a break. 10 minutes. Hydrate, stretch, then I want to see you working on your basic forms." To Blackwood, she added, "My office. Now, we need to discuss your teaching methodology." As the coach stalked off, his face dark with suppressed anger, Victoria turned back to Marcus and Emma. For the first time, her voice softened slightly. "She can observe the training sessions if you're comfortable with that. No obligations, no pressure. Just an opportunity to see what we do here." Marcus nodded once. "Thank you." Victoria gave the smallest of smiles and walked away, leaving father and daughter standing at the edge of a world that had suddenly become a little more welcoming. Emma whispered, "Dad, she's incredible." Marcus smiled, settling into one of the observation chairs. "She's something, all right." 2 days later, the autumn air carried a chill that seemed to seep through the walls of the training facility. Marcus stood in the equipment room, helping Emma adjust the borrowed training uniform that hung loose on her small frame. The sleeves had been rolled up twice, the belt wrapped around her narrow waist with enough extra length to nearly touch the floor. "You don't have to do this, Em," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that he rarely allowed her to hear. "If you change your mind, we can leave right now. No questions asked." Emma looked up at him, her chin set in a line he recognized from her mother. The same stubborn determination that had carried Sarah through nursing school while working 2 jobs, the same fierce resolve that had sustained her through the darkest days of her illness. "I want to try, Dad. I need to know if I can do this." Inside the main training hall, the atmosphere buzzed with controlled energy. Students stretched and warmed up under the watchful eye of Master Klaus Hoffmann, a compact man in his 60s whose every movement spoke of decades spent perfecting his craft. His gray hair was cropped short, his face weathered by time and experience, but his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who missed nothing. Victoria stood near her office, reviewing paperwork on a tablet, but Marcus could see her attention was divided between her administrative duties and the activity on the training floor. Coach Blackwood occupied the far corner of the space, working with a group of advanced students. His movements were technically perfect, but there was a mechanical quality to his instruction that hadn't been there before Victoria's intervention. "Hey there, Emma." A teenage girl with long blonde hair jogged over, her smile genuine and welcoming. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, but everyone calls me Mitch. Ready for your first class?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, and Marcus felt some of his tension ease as he watched his daughter follow the older girl onto the mats. She looked so small among the other students, but there was something in her posture that suggested she belonged here, that she was ready to claim her place in this world. "She has your confidence." Victoria's voice came from behind him, soft enough that he almost missed it over the sounds of training. Marcus turned, surprised by her presence. "My confidence?" "That quiet certainty," Victoria replied, her gaze fixed on Emma as she listened intently to Mitch's instructions. "Like she knows she belongs here, even when others might suggest otherwise." Marcus watched his daughter attempt her first basic stance, wobbling slightly before finding her balance. "She doesn't get that from me. She just hasn't learned to be afraid yet. Or maybe," Victoria said thoughtfully, "she has learned and chooses to move forward anyway." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both watching as Emma slowly began to relax into the rhythm of the class. Her movements were awkward, uncertain, but there was an earnestness to her effort that drew approving nods from Master Hoffman. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, "for what you did the other day, for seeing her." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't do it out of charity, Marcus. I did it because—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Because there's something fundamentally wrong with the culture we've allowed to develop here. I just hadn't realized how toxic it had become until I saw your daughter's face." Marcus studied her profile, noting the way her voice tightened when she spoke about the facility. "You built this place, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. "My late husband designed it. I provided the funding and the vision. David wanted to create something special, a place where young people could learn not just combat techniques, but character. Where the goal wasn't just to create fighters, but to build human beings who understood the true meaning of strength." "And now?" Marcus asked gently. Victoria's expression darkened. "Now it's become exactly what David feared most. A factory for producing technically proficient students who mistake arrogance for confidence and brutality for strength." Marcus glanced toward where Blackwood was drilling his advanced students through a series of aggressive combinations. "He gets results, though? The parents seem to love him." "Results," Victoria said bitterly. "Trophies and rankings and social media posts. Everything except the one thing that actually matters, helping young people become the best versions of themselves." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with obvious irritation. "Coach Blackwood wants to schedule what he calls a demonstration of superiority next week. Says it will showcase the Academy's elite standards." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like he's looking for revenge." Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched as Emma successfully completed a basic combination, her face lighting up with pure joy at the small victory. "Let him plan his demonstration," she said finally. "I have some ideas of my own." Marcus studied her expression, recognizing something he'd seen in the mirror during his military days. The look of someone preparing for battle. "You have a strategy." She looked at him directly for the first time in their conversation. "Not yet, but I have something better." "Which is?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes. "I have questions I should have asked years ago, and I think I finally have the courage to ask them." 3 days later, Marcus found himself standing in front of a cracked mirror in the facility's old locker room, adjusting the collar of a training uniform he hadn't worn in nearly a decade. The fabric was faded military green, creased from years of storage in the back of his closet. A small patch on the shoulder bore the ghost of a unit insignia that had been carefully removed, leaving only the faint outline of what once was. "You sure about this?" Mitch's voice carried a note of concern as she appeared in the doorway. "Blackwood's been training for this all week. He's brought in some of his old competition buddies to watch." Marcus tied his belt slowly, the muscle memory returning despite the years. "I'm not here to put on a show, Mitch. I'm here to make a point." "Which is?" He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her take a step back. Not from fear, but from recognition. For just a moment, the quiet maintenance worker was gone, replaced by someone who had faced down situations where hesitation meant death and precision meant survival. "That my daughter deserves to train in a place where strength is measured by character, not cruelty." Outside in the main training area, a crowd had gathered. Word of the impromptu challenge had spread beyond the academy, drawing current students, parents, and even some local martial arts enthusiasts who had heard whispers of the confrontation between the decorated coach and the mysterious maintenance man. Victoria had insisted that if this demonstration was going to happen, it would be conducted transparently, with witnesses and clear rules. No backroom sparring, no politics, just truth displayed on the mats for everyone to see. Master Hoffman sat in a place of honor near the edge of the training area, his weathered hands folded on his lap. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus caught the old man's eye and received the slightest of nods, acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. Coach Blackwood stood at the center of the mats, resplendent in his crisp white uniform with its perfectly pressed creases and gleaming black belt. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, never questioned his right to occupy the space he claimed. "I have to admit," Blackwood said as Marcus approached, his voice pitched to carry to the assembled crowd, "I'm surprised you actually showed up. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve along with your uniform." Marcus bowed respectfully, the gesture precise and traditional. Blackwood returned the bow with mechanical efficiency, his smile never wavering. Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "This is a controlled demonstration. No strikes to the head. No submissions unless verbally acknowledged. Stop immediately when commanded. Are we clear?" Both men nodded their understanding. "Begin." For the first several seconds, neither fighter moved. Marcus settled into a relaxed stance, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. Blackwood circled like a predator, his feet dancing lightly on the mats, every line of his body proclaiming his readiness to unleash devastation. Then, with explosive suddenness, Blackwood attacked. His spinning kick was textbook perfect, delivered with the kind of speed and precision that had earned him championship titles. The technique sliced through the air with surgical accuracy, aimed at Marcus's ribs with enough force to drop a man half his size. Marcus wasn't there. He had moved not with panic or desperation, but with the kind of effortless precision that comes from years of training in environments where mistakes have permanent consequences. The kick passed harmlessly through empty space as Marcus flowed around it like water around a stone. Another attack followed immediately, a lightning-fast combination of punches designed to overwhelm through sheer volume and aggression. Marcus evaded them all, his movements minimal and economical, never using more energy than absolutely necessary. The crowd leaned forward, confused by what they were witnessing. This wasn't the explosive confrontation they had expected. It was something altogether more subtle and infinitely more impressive. Emma sat beside Mitch at the edge of the mats, her small hands clenched in her lap. "Why isn't he fighting back?" she whispered. Mitch's gaze never left the action. "Because he doesn't need to. Not yet." Blackwood's attacks grew more frenzied, his breathing becoming labored as frustration began to cloud his judgment. His techniques were still technically sound, but they carried the desperation of a man who was beginning to realize that his opponent was operating on an entirely different level. Marcus moved like smoke, like shadow, like the memory of violence rather than violence itself. He didn't counterattack because he didn't need to. Every evasion was a lesson, every sidestep a demonstration of the vast gulf between technical proficiency and true mastery. "Are you afraid to engage me?" Blackwood snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Or are you just going to dance around like a coward all day?" Marcus's response was soft, but it carried to every corner of the now silent training hall. "I'm afraid I might teach you something you're not ready to learn." The words hit like a physical blow. Several spectators audibly gasped, and Victoria found herself holding her breath as she watched the drama unfold. That's when Blackwood made his fatal mistake. Rage overcame discipline, and he launched himself forward in a wild, uncontrolled assault that would have been devastating if it had connected. Instead, Marcus simply stepped aside, caught his opponent's momentum, and redirected it into the mat with a technique so subtle that many observers missed it entirely. Blackwood hit the floor hard, the sound of his impact echoing through the sudden silence. For a moment, he lay there, stunned not just by the fall, but by the realization that he had been outclassed by someone he had dismissed as a mere maintenance worker. Marcus stepped back and bowed again, the gesture as respectful as it had been at the beginning of the encounter. He offered no celebration, no triumph, just the quiet dignity of someone who had proven his point without needing to destroy another human being in the process. "This demonstration is concluded," Victoria announced, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. She looked at Blackwood, who was slowly picking himself up from the mat. "Would you like to say anything?" Blackwood's face was flushed, whether from exertion or embarrassment, it was impossible to tell. "No," he said quietly. "I have nothing to say." Victoria nodded once. "Very well." She turned to Marcus. "You didn't come here to prove your superiority." Marcus glanced at Emma, then back at Victoria. "No, I came here to show her that you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. That real strength comes from knowing when not to use it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that extended far beyond the confines of a simple sparring match. As Marcus walked back to where Emma waited, the assembled crowd began to applaud. Not the wild cheering that typically follows a spectacular victory, but the steady, respectful acknowledgement of something deeper and more meaningful. And somewhere in Victoria Sterling's carefully guarded heart, something that had been frozen for years began to thaw. The weeks that followed brought subtle but significant changes to the Elite Combat Academy. Coach Blackwood submitted his resignation via email on a Friday afternoon, citing philosophical differences with the facility's evolving direction. His departure created a vacuum that Victoria was determined to fill with something better, something that honored her late husband's original vision. Marcus found himself spending more time at the academy, officially to address various maintenance issues that had been neglected for months, but increasingly to help with instruction. His approach was radically different from anything the students had experienced. He taught not just techniques, but the philosophy behind them, the understanding that true martial arts were about building character rather than breaking opponents. Emma thrived in this new environment. Her natural athleticism, combined with an intuitive understanding of movement and balance, made her a quick learner. More importantly, her presence seemed to inspire other students to approach their training with renewed enthusiasm and respect. One evening, as autumn deepened into winter, Marcus was working alone in the facility's small workshop when Victoria appeared in the doorway. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, a far cry from her usual business attire, and carried 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering him one of the cups. Marcus accepted it gratefully, noting the way the warm ceramic felt against his oil-stained hands. "Thanks. What brings you by so late?" Victoria settled into a chair across from his workbench, her gaze drifting to the tools and spare parts scattered across its surface. "I've been thinking about what you said during the demonstration, about teaching Emma that strength comes from knowing when not to use it, and I realized I've spent the last 5 years being afraid to use mine." She took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "After David died, I convinced myself that maintaining the status quo was the same as honoring his memory. I let other people make decisions about the direction of this place because it felt safer than risking failure." Marcus set down his wrench and gave her his full attention. "You were grieving. That's understandable. Was I?" Victoria's smile was rueful. "Or was I just taking the easy path?" David used to say that the hardest part of leadership isn't making the right decision. It's making any decision at all when you're afraid of the consequences. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the workshop's overhead lights casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the windows with delicate crystals. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said finally. "Sure. That day when Blackwood humiliated you and Emma, why didn't you respond? You could have put him in his place right then and there. You certainly had the skills." Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because if I had reacted in anger, Emma would have remembered that lesson longer than anything positive I could teach her later. Children learn more from what they see us do under pressure than from what we tell them when times are easy." Victoria nodded slowly. "David would have said the same thing. He sounds like he was a good man. The best." Her voice carried the weight of loss, but also something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "He used to joke that he married me for my business sense, and I married him for his wisdom. Turns out we both got the better end of the deal." Marcus smiled. "Sounds like a partnership worth honoring." "I think so too, which is why I've made a decision." Victoria straightened in her chair, her executive persona reasserting itself. "I want to offer you a position here. Not maintenance, instruction. I want you to help me rebuild this place into what David always envisioned it could be." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Marcus felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, mixed with possibility. "I'm not certified," he said finally. "I don't have the credentials that parents expect to see." "Then we'll get you certified. Or better yet, we'll create our own standards." standards based on character and competence rather than politics and profit. Marcus looked around the workshop, at the tools that had been his companions for so many years, at the familiar comfort of mechanical problems with mechanical solutions. Then he thought about Emma's face when she successfully completed her first form, about the way the other students had begun to look up to her despite her age and size. What about the board? The parents? They're not going to accept a maintenance worker as an instructor. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Let me worry about the politics. You just focus on teaching these kids what it really means to be strong. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with Emma, helping her with homework that seemed absurdly simple compared to the complexity of the decision he was facing. The house was quiet except for the soft scratching of pencil on paper and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "Dad," Emma said, without looking up from her math worksheet. "Yeah, kiddo. Are you going to become a teacher at the academy?" Marcus blinked, surprised by her directness. "What makes you think that?" Emma finally looked up, and he saw Sarah's intelligence shining in her young eyes. "Because Ms. Sterling looks at you the same way she looks at the old pictures in her office. Like you remind her of something good she thought was gone forever." The perception in her words left him momentarily speechless. At 8 years old, Emma had noticed something that he was just beginning to acknowledge himself. "Would you like it if I became a teacher there?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. "I think Mom would like it," she said finally. "She always said you were good at helping people find their way back to themselves." The next morning brought news that would change everything. Marcus arrived at the academy to find Victoria in her office, surrounded by paperwork and wearing an expression that could have frozen steel. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "The Regional Martial Arts Board has received a formal complaint about our recent changes in operational procedure." Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk. "Let me guess. Someone objected to unqualified personnel providing instruction. That's putting it mildly. They're threatening to review our certification. If they decide we're not maintaining proper standards, they could shut us down entirely." The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus thought about Emma, about the progress she had made, about the other students who had begun to flourish under the academy's new approach. "What do you need me to do?" Victoria looked up from her paperwork, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Determination mixed with something that might have been love. "I need you to be exactly who you are," she said, "because I'm done compromising David's vision to appease bureaucrats who measure success in certificates rather than character." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, in a sterile conference room that smelled of disinfectant and disappointment. 5 board members sat behind a polished table, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Marcus wore his one good suit, feeling like an imposter among the bureaucrats and politicians who would decide the academy's fate. Victoria sat beside him, radiating the kind of controlled fury that comes from years of corporate boardroom battles. She had prepared for this fight with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign, armed with documentation, testimonials, and a righteous anger that burned like a slow fuse. "Let's begin," announced the board chairman, a thin man whose pinched features suggested he had never smiled in his entire life. "We're here to address serious concerns about the operational standards at the Elite Combat Academy." For the next hour, Marcus sat quietly as the board members dissected every aspect of the academy's recent changes. They questioned his qualifications, challenged Victoria's decision-making, and suggested that allowing unaccredited instructors to teach students was tantamount to fraud. Through it all, Victoria remained calm, answering each accusation with facts and documentation. She presented student progress reports, parent testimonials, and evidence of improved retention rates since the academy had adopted its new approach. Finally, the chairman turned his attention to Marcus. "Mr. Weber, you've been unusually quiet during these proceedings. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Marcus stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "I spent 12 years in military service, learning that true leadership isn't about titles or certifications. It's about showing up every day and making the people around you better than they thought they could be." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "These kids don't care about my credentials. They care about whether I see them as individuals, whether I believe in their potential, whether I'm willing to meet them where they are and help them become who they're meant to be." The room was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic. If that's not enough for your board, Marcus continued, then maybe the problem isn't with our standards. Maybe it's with yours. The decision came 3 days later in the form of a terse email that Victoria read aloud to Marcus in her office. After careful consideration, the board has determined that the Elite Combat Academy's operational practices do not meet current regional standards. Certification is hereby revoked, effective immediately. They sat in stunned silence, the weight of failure settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Years of work, dreams, and hope reduced to a single paragraph of bureaucratic language. "I'm sorry," Marcus said finally. "I cost you everything." Victoria looked up from her computer screen, and to his surprise, she was smiling. "No," she said quietly. "You gave me everything back." 6 months later, a new sign appeared in the window of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. Community Warriors, where character meets combat. The space was raw and unfinished, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting, but it hummed with an energy that the sterile perfection of the Elite Combat Academy had never possessed. Marcus stood at the center of the training area, working with a group of students that included Emma and several others who had followed them from the old academy. The mats were secondhand, the equipment donated or purchased at thrift stores, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the quality of instruction, the depth of respect, and the understanding that martial arts were about building human beings, not just fighters. Victoria worked the business side of the operation from a small office in the corner of the warehouse, but she frequently joined the training sessions, rediscovering her own love for the arts that had drawn her to David years earlier. "Think we made the right choice?" she asked Marcus one evening as they watched Emma demonstrate a complex form to the younger students. Marcus wrapped his arm around her shoulders, still amazed by the turn his life had taken. "Ask me in 10 years when these kids are changing the world." Emma finished her demonstration and jogged over to where they stood. "Did you see that, Dad? I didn't miss a single technique." "I saw it, kiddo. Your mom would be proud." Emma grinned and hugged them both. "I think she is proud. I think she's watching all of us." As the snow continued to fall outside the windows of their makeshift dojo, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had lost a job, but found a calling. Victoria had sacrificed respectability, but gained authenticity. Emma had discovered not just martial arts, but the confidence that comes from knowing she belonged somewhere. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that look like defeats to everyone else. Sometimes the greatest strength is found not in fighting for what you want, but in standing up for what you believe, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, when you're willing to lose everything for the right reasons, you discover that you've actually gained something worth far more than what you left behind. And sometimes, when you're willing to lose everything for the right reasons, you discover that you've actually gained something worth far more than what you left behind. Marcus Weber started as just a maintenance worker with oil-stained hands and a broken heart. But he ended up teaching an entire community that true strength isn't about the belt around your waist. It's about the courage to stand up when it matters most, even when the whole world is watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes can come from the most unexpected places, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the most important lesson you've learned from someone others might have overlooked? And if you believe in stories that celebrate the quiet warriors among us, the ones who choose kindness over cruelty and character over competition, then hit that subscribe button. Because every week, we share tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, proving that the best victories aren't always the loudest ones. Thanks for joining Marcus and Emma on their journey. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who never asked to be in the spotlight.